Hi, it's Marilyn from Simply Their Story. Today, I want to share with you a story of hope in time of suffering, a story of ordinary people, a story of how God works behind the scenes to just care for them and treasure them and take them to where He needs them to be. This is the story of one family. This is the story of Ruth. Hello, my name is Ruth. I was born in the kingdom of Moab. Now, Moab is east of the Dead Sea and bounded by Edom in the land of the Amorites. It's set between the Arnon and the Zered valleys. The Arnon is the deepest gorge in the whole of the Jordan. It's 2 miles wide at its upper edge. When there was a famine in the land of Israel, a man called Elimelech arrived from Bethlehem with his wife Naomi and their 2 very handsome sons. The sons' names were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, Moab receives a lot more rain than the eastern fringes of Israel because the moisture is picked up by the humid Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea by the prevailing westerly winds. So the famines didn't reach our land. And it was here that they came from Bethlehem to take refuge. Now, they were a family of quite high standing back in Bethlehem, and they settled in very easily to a life in Moab because Israel and Moab do share some kinship. And they share a similar history and there's some language similarities. So the closeness that often leads to competition and strife actually meant that they understood our language and they knew some of our customs. Although we didn't share the same religion, we have multiple gods, including the god of Chemos, as Moabites. Anyhow, once they'd been here for a little while, the father of the family decided it was time for the sons to marry, and he arranged marriages for his 2 sons from the highborn families in Moab. Myself from Mahlon and Oprah for his other son, Chilion. Just before the marriages were to take place, he actually passed away. But the marriages went ahead anyway in honor of his wishes. And I was about 14 at the time. And Mahlon was kind. And I agreed to love and respect him. Although I admit I didn't always understand their customs. And I didn't understand their reverence for this one true God. But I settled in happily to married life. Oprah and I became good friends. And we learned to love our mother-in-law Naomi. She was kind and wise and loving and welcoming. And we had 10 very happy years. They were tranquil. We both weren't blessed with children, but we were young and that didn't seem as important. We had our whole lives ahead of us. And then a double tragedy struck. Both our husbands died. We were left bereft, broken, alone. There was no provider to stand for any of us 3 women, and we had no children to remember them by. And our grief over the loss of such kind, considerate, gentle husbands was unbearable. But Naomi's loss was inconsolable. She turned quite inward and she became very bitter and angry and withdrawn. She told us to call her Mara, which means bitter, and said her future was very, very bleak and empty. And then she heard that the famine in Bethlehem was over, and she made the decision to return to her hometown, as there they would care for widows and orphans. She wanted us So she told us she wanted to go home. She wanted us to return to our families. Bear in mind, I was only about 24, so there was time for me to marry again, start a new life, and possibly still have children. But the thought horrified me. I loved Naomi. To lose her after losing Mahlon was just too much to bear, and I begged to stay with her. And Oprah felt exactly the same. Although she had very strong ties with her mum, who wanted her home desperately. And after a short time, while Naomi was making her plans, the reality of having no provider really started to bite hard. Our stores ran low. You know, the neighbors were kind, but they all had their own families to feed. And so once Naomi's plans were complete and she was ready to go, she said goodbye. And we begged her to let us come with her. We loved her so much. Everything we knew as adults was with her, and we wanted to go with her. When we reached the boundaries between Moab and Judah, Naomi turned to us, and I could see in her eyes this was goodbye. She kissed us and she told us to return to our families, to be blessed for being such good wives and such good daughters, but to go home and restart our lives while we could. All three of us were in tears. We begged her not to send us away. She told us that they had a Levitical law that if she had other sons, they would marry us and have sons and daughters with us and take care of us. But she didn't. And if she was to start now, it would be a long time before they were able to take care of anybody. So there wasn't a really practical solution. She was so deeply sad, so bitter at this awful deal that life had handed to her. She had left Bethlehem as a married woman with 2 wonderful sons, and now she would be returning a widow with just 2 Gentile daughters. Oprah finally tearfully agreed to go, and she left for a life that she would know, a life in Moab with her family to support her. I'm sure she would remarry and have children, and she knew the culture, she knew the gods. But I loved Naomi. She'd been so loving towards me from day one. This young Gentile bride who was clueless about their family ways. She'd intrigued me with her devotion to God. And now in her darkest hour, she was prepared to send me home to sacrifice the only support that she would have. She would have to travel all the way to Judah, all on her own, cross the river, pass through bandit territory because the judges ruled and everyone did as they pleased. And it didn't seem right or fair to me. My love for her, my loyalty to this family who had taken me in, just stirred. She told me to go after Oprah, but I thought of all her kindness and her love, and I thought of that long journey, and I said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following after you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death should part me from you. Bless Naomi. She saw I meant it. I would not leave her. I would not give up on our love, or the love I'd seen from her God. She pressed my hands hard. She wiped the tears off my cheeks and then off her own, and she bent to pick up the small bundle that represented half our goods. She gave it to me to carry, and she bent and picked up the other bundle. And we turned our eyes towards the far horizon and crossed from Moab into Judah. And the way was dusty and so dry. We had a little bread that got stale really quickly, and we had a few skins of water to see us through. But en route, Naomi began to teach me more about her God, what he had done for the people of Israel. She taught me some of the customs and the cultural practices that I would expect to see and become part of now that we were heading into Bethlehem. You know, the more I heard about it, the more I heard about God, the more glad I was that I walked beside her. This was a gracious, powerful God who really loved his people. So the 2 of us went on until we came to Bethlehem. We arrived after 11 days, weary, dirty, hungry, and I was amazed. The town stirred and came out to welcome Naomi home. Suddenly the wounds of her loss tore open, and her bitterness just poured out. She had left Bethlehem a decade before with a husband and 2 boys, and she returned a widower with no grandchildren, just 1 foreign daughter-in-law. She wanted the town people to also call her Mara for bitter, and she railed against God for what had happened. Her old town, they were amazing. They cleaned out her own house, and the women were so generous. They bought us blankets and some bowls and other items that they could spare to help us settle into our life in Bethlehem. They treated Naomi with so much love and respect. My reception, a little bit cool. I was an outsider. I'd grown up worshipping foreign idols, And they didn't really trust the Moabites because we had a turbulent history between us. They even gave us some supplies, some food and some oil. But we couldn't rely on their charity forever. So Naomi had told me of a way that God helped people to provide for themselves during the harvest. Farmers would allow them to glean the stalks after they'd been harvested that had fallen to the ground. The poor could go and pick them up and keep whatever they could carry. And it was now close to their festival of Passover, so the barley harvest was in. So once I knew Naomi was fine on her own and settled into the new house, I nervously covered my face and headed out to the fields. And Naomi warned me not to talk to any of the men. She said, as a foreigner, I would be treated with great suspicion at best, but I also wouldn't be treated with the respect deserving of a widow, and I was to be careful. The first field I came to had so many people gathering. I was intimidated, so I just kept walking. I was praying for God, please show me where to gather, please protect me. These people speak so fast and their dialect makes it really hard to understand the conversation, and they're all laughing and joking and I don't really know what they're saying. Finally, I came to a field. The workers here were super organized and the fields looked beautiful with crops ripe and golden in the sun. I found the foreman as Naomi had told me to, and I asked him, please may I glean here? When he heard who I was, he gave me permission. The early morning breeze ruffled my hair and bent the heavy laden kernels towards the earth. I opened up the shawl Naomi had given me and spread it on the ground, and I began to pick up stalks lying on the ground where the workers had finished. Back-breaking work. Bend, gather, 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 gather till you're holding all you can. Stand up, walk to your shawl, put it down, cover it so it doesn't blow away, and repeat, 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 repeat. I wanted to work hard as I wanted to have enough for at least 2 days, so that while I was gone the next day, Naomi would have food and not go hungry. When the sun was hot on my covered head, all I could smell was the baked earth, and I settled into a rhythm of work. At about mid-morning, I was carrying my little bundle to add to the shawl when I saw a gathering workers over there at the top of the field. They were talking to a well-dressed man with a quiet authority about him. And as I watched, the man's eyes met mine and I glanced away quickly. I could feel my face flashing, not from the sun, and I scurried back to continue with my work. There was an intensity in his gaze that was a bit unsettling. I chided myself. Really, why on earth are you thinking blushing like a young girl? You're a widow and a foreigner. He's a local landowner. He's probably wondering, what's this scruffy woman doing in my field and who said she couldn't be here? After a while, I got ready to take more stalks back to the shore when I felt someone behind me. I stood and turned, and the farmer had walked across the field and he was standing behind me. He told me his name was Boaz, and this was his portion of the fields. His dark robes flapped around his legs in the wind, and he squinted at me as he looked into the sun. He had kindness etched into the corners of his eyes, and he smiled at me. In a lovely, rich, deep voice, he told me to keep gleaning near the woman who worked for him. He said that his young men had been told not to bother me, and I was to drink water from the vessels that they had drawn. I think he saw that my water skin was really empty. I dropped down to the ground before his feet. His kindness after the coolness of the townsfolk, the stress of losing my husband, the journey to a foreign land was just overwhelming. Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should notice me, a foreigner? Gentle Boaz. He reached his hand down and helped me up to my feet. All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people you did not know. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. I felt quite shy at such words of praise, and I dropped my head. I just said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, that I'm not one of yours. I had to admit my heart was beating a bit faster than usual. He was so kind to take notice of me, to take the trouble to come and talk to me. It was really unexpected, and I'm only human. I couldn't help noticing those cheekbones, the deep smile, the humble dignity of those broad shoulders. Anyhow, I put that out of my mind and I continued to work. Until it was time for the workers to take a break for a meal. I hadn't brought any food with me, for what little we had I had left behind for Naomi. And now, bless God, through Boaz he provided. Boaz called me over to where the workers were relaxing. He invited me to eat of their bread, which was dipped in wine. He gave me so much I couldn't eat it all, and I carefully wrapped it and tucked it in my bag to give to Naomi when I got home. I thanked Boaz and his workers and returned to work. I did notice that after the meal, the men seemed to be rather careless and dropped bundles in my way. So I asked if I could pick them up, and they told me that Boaz had said I could, and that I could gather from amongst the sheaves too, which was so much easier than the back-breaking gleaning. I continued working until the sun began to set, and then I beat out the kernels, and I had at least an ephah of barley to take home. What a good harvest for my first day! Thank you, Boaz, for such kindness. My back ached as I made my way home. My hands were chafed and raw. My skin felt tight and dry from the wind, but my heart soared ahead of me. I had plenty of food for us, including the bread left over from the midday meal. May have soared a tiny bit higher at being noticed by the handsome Boaz and on being on the receiving end of such unwarranted, open-handed generosity. When I got home, Naomi was amazed. Tears stood out in her eyes as she ate from the food I had packed away and stored the grain for the next day. I told her everything, where I had worked and how the farmer had been so kind to me. She asked me his name, and when I said Boaz, she stopped eating and a twinkle came into her eye that I hadn't seen through all these months of sorrow. She said, May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Then she went on to tell me that Boaz was a relative of hers. He had the power to redeem us. I told her he said I could keep gleaning in his field until the end of harvest as I had his protection, and she told me to do so. So for the rest of the harvest period, I would head straight to Boaz's field. And I often saw him in the distance, and sometimes I thought he was watching me, but if I looked towards him, he looked away or into the distance, so maybe not. Towards the end of the harvest, Naomi asked me to trust her. She wanted to help me secure a future in this hometown of Bethlehem. We knew that Boaz would be winnowing that night on the threshing floor. Now, this meant he would be tossing the cut stems into the air, and the evening breeze would blow across them, blowing the chaff away, and the good grain would fall to the ground where it would be gathered and stored. Now, at the time of winnowing, it was a long, dirty job that had to be done in the evening, so men generally slept the night on the winnowing floor, and also to protect their grain until it had gone into proper storage. So Naomi told me that day I was to wash the dust and sweat of the day away and dress in my finest and best. She gave me some oil to fragrance my hair with, and then she gently placed a cloak around my shoulders. She told me to go to the threshing floor, but to remain out of sight until all the work was done. Once Boaz had finished his evening meal, I was to follow her instructions, even though they were pretty strange to me. I made my way back to the field and up to the raised platform that was used for winnowing. I stood in the shadows as I watched this farmer going about this task. It was a rhythmic and well-practiced routine. Then I watched him settle to his evening meal. He was eating bread dipped in olive oil, and I watched as he drank wine directly from the wineskin. And then he rubbed a hand over his face and he settled his cloak down, getting ready to go to sleep next to his pile of grain. And I waited a bit longer until I knew he was sleeping. And then you've no idea, my heart was pounding in my chest as I walked across to him softly and I uncovered his feet and I lay down. All I could hear was my own breathing, which sounded so loud. And I was too scared to even move in case I disturbed him. I could feel the hard ground digging into my hips and the evening breeze cooling my skin. And each minute felt like an hour. And then around midnight, Boaz startled and turned over. And on seeing me, they asked, "Who are you?" And I answered exactly as Naomi had said to me. I said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are my redeemer." And then I felt absolutely sick to my stomach waiting for his response, because basically I was asking for his protection and he could just send me packing. And then into the darkness his voice sounded and he said, I'll never forget, he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." Boaz went on to tell me that while everyone was saying how worthy I was and what I had done for Naomi and how he would love to be my redeemer, there was another man who had more right than him. And my heart sank. How could Naomi have got it wrong? I didn't know who this other older man was. And I didn't want him to be my redeemer. I wanted Boaz to be my redeemer. But Boaz told me to stay there for the night, and he covered me with his cloak. And he would sort it out in the morning, and one of them would redeem me. And so I lay back down with a prayer on my lips, and I went to sleep. Just before it got light, I woke up before people could recognize me, and I went home. And Boaz strictly instructed everybody who was there not to mention that there had been a woman on the winnowing floor. But just before I left, he had taken my cloak and filled it with 6 measures of barley. And I walked pretty quickly home. It had been a very strange night. I went to tell Naomi all that had happened, and she smiled. And then her smile widened when she saw all the barley, and she told me to go and sleep properly and not to go gleaning that day, because Boaz did mean business, and he would resolve the matter that day if he could. Do you know what? He did. He came to our home later that afternoon and told us he had gone to sit at the gate, which is where all the men did the big business. And he'd waited until he saw this older relative that he had mentioned. He had then spoken to him in front of 10 witnesses, so it was all honourable and above board, and told him that Naomi wanted to sell her husband's land, and the relative had first option to buy it and keep it in the family, and he'd be helping Naomi. And this older man had said yes, he thought that was quite a good idea. Maybe he would go ahead and buy it, until he heard that it came with Naomi and a Moabite daughter who he would have to marry. Then he backed off really quickly, and he just said that any children he had with me would then divide his inheritance, so he wasn't in a position to do that. They had settled the deal, and he drew off his sandal and passed it to Boaz before witnesses. And Boaz called the witnesses to take note that he would redeem Naomi by buying what had belonged to her husband and sons, and he would perpetuate their line by marrying her daughter, me. He said the witnesses had acknowledged the transaction and said a blessing over us. And so here I am, from widow to bride, from refugee to landowner to wife, and yes, eventually to mother. That joy at holding my son for the first time, all those hardships and heartache had led to this day. And I remember the joy being reflected so clearly in dear Naomi's eyes, her first grandchild, the joy of her old age. Boaz and I named him Obed, and he is totally the child of my heart, and unknown to us, would become part of the bloodline, the greatest king Israel would ever know. Isn't it a beautiful story? Both the love between Ruth and her daughter-in-law, and of course the love between Ruth and Boaz. I just love how there are so many examples here of God's incredible love for us. How Jesus is our Redeemer. How he also stepped forward and made a bargain to secure our future, made a bargain to make us part of his family, his kingdom, and his inheritance. And there's so much how honorable is Ruth, how faithful, how brave. She just does what Naomi tells her because she trusts her. And I love that. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this story. I want to encourage you, go to the Old Testament, read in the book of Ruth from chapters 1 to 4 and find out for yourself about this lovely story and look for all the signs of how much God's love shines through this most famous, most beautiful story of incredible love. See you again on Simply the Story.